The race is on, and while there's still 10 races left of the current season, already the focus is starting to shift to F1's brave new rules world in 2026. But what should we expect from the regulations overhaul? And amid widespread negativity about the impact it will have on the racing next year, how do we sort the fact from the fiction when it comes to expectations? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me for a look at the future are Samarth, Kanal and John Noble. Well, Samarth, welcome back. You're very technically minded, so you must love a regulations overhaul. Thrilled about 2026, surely.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I find it hard to be excited about most things, and so I'm trying not to let that come forward here. But I am excited that there is a rules overhaul for sure. I'm very excited to see what the talented people in F1 can do with a new set of aerodynamic and power unit regulations for sure. I really am. But there is a question as to whether these regulations are truly necessary at a time like this. And given how good, and I will say the racing has been excellent this season and over the last few seasons, given how big the cars are, given how wide they are, and given the tracks that we race on, I think this is just about as good as it gets. And okay, take that with a pinch of salt because you can always ignore two cars dominating from McLaren, but even then it's still exciting. So you're at risk of kind of recessing all of that next year, and that's kind of my biggest worry with a rules overhaul, that we could get one team dominate. Now, I'm sorry to do some shameless plugging here, but if you go to www.raceteq.com, Dan Fallows, former Red Bull and Aston Martin engineer, has penned a very good opinion piece on the 2026 regulations overhaul. So if you go there, you'll find it. And he honestly sums it up quite well in saying there is a risk that we're throwing it all away with the 2026 regulations. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. There are some good bits. But my favorite bit about it is that we're going to see some new innovation and teams kind of pushing themselves to be at the front. And I'm sure we'll go into who those teams will be later.
Well, that's the exciting thing. It's always into the unknown. And yeah, you've touched on some of the topics we're going to be talking through in this podcast. But John, 2026, I don't know about you, but it's been looming for such a long time. It's always been this far off intangible, hasn't it? But recently it's suddenly started to get very, very real, hasn't it? And feel like, it's really coming there. So how big a talking point do you think this is now becoming in the F1 paddock?
I think as the reality of teams continuing to work on their cars, I think this is what's made it more real, is that up until, January the 1st, no team had started proper aerodynamic work, so they weren't really sure what was going on, and it seemed so far away. But now teams have wound down work on the 25 cars, they've ramped up the work on the 26 cars, they've started working out where are the grey areas, where are the performance aspects, how's the power unit fit into this. As everything comes together, it becomes very real. And also in F1 terms, 6 months, to us seems a while, it's quite a way to go. But actually to teams, that's literally tomorrow because F1 moves so fast. So there is no time now. These cars are happening. They're being kind of readied as in this kind of speed that F1 operates. And before we know it, we'll be kind of 3-4 races down in this whole new era.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly it comes along. And of course, the battle's already raging, isn't it? That development battle behind the scenes, maybe racing on track still in 25, but the race very much is on for 2026 already. But John, the foundation stone for 2026 is the power unit. It remains a 1.6 litre V6 turbo, just as the current cars are. Where it differs is first, there's no MGU-H anymore, and the second is that the electrical power is a much more significant slice of the total power of the car. So what do you expect from these power units?
It's really, really difficult to know what to expect and what to think because there's so much uncertainty. And I think human beings, especially human beings who are involved in engineering and Formula One, always like to focus on the negatives of something. When change happens, if it's a good thing, we don't often kind of celebrate it. It's just kind of this is what the natural thing that we think happens is that things become better. So we like to obsess when things become worse because you think, what are we doing? And, we do hear about engine recovery becoming extreme. We do hear about the cars being energy starved, that they're going to be losing power on the straights. We do hear about them having less downforce in the corners. We've heard about, the whole power unit regulations were a compromise in the first place. And then we've had to compromise the car regulations because the engines regulations are a compromise. So there's lots and lots of elements that aren't fantastic and ideal, which kind of, I think, cloud the image we have for 26. But equally, we may get some positive surprises.
Yeah, exactly. I always remember when the 2014 regs came along, there was a lot of negativity about what it's like to drive in the simulator, etc., holding the cars in weird gears, not shifting because they had so much torque, etc., etc. So you've always got to take with a little bit of a pinch of salt where things are at. But obviously these power units are hugely challenging, aren't they, Samarth? Because we talk about 50-50 split conventional V6 to electrical power. It's really more like 45-55 probably, with the way things work out in terms of how much energy you're allowed to harvest and deploy, plus what the de facto fuel flow regulations permit, which is an energy flow rather than a fuel flow as it is now. Do you think that fundamentally that idea works, and how many problems do you think is created? How many problems do you think are created by the fact that F1's trying to make this very, very ambitious electrical contribution work?
So there's a lot being said about, the massive electrical proportion of the car. Firstly, I think I'm quite glad that they're ditching the MGUH. I think it was too complicated a part of the power unit, and it's always good to streamline it down. And I think the best thing about that would have been to kind of boast the potential weight loss with that, but F1 hasn't kind of gone down that route, which is a bit of a shame. I think there was something to be had there by ditching a part of the engine. But fine, we've got the MG UK, and now it's providing more of the energy of the power unit. And as John touched on, I think the big worry is our team's going to be running out of power, basically, down the straights, and how much of a problem is that going to cause? I think my issue here is that we just don't know the reality of racing in 2026. We've got all this speculation. I've seen reports, some of them seem credible, some of them seem less credible, of what this new power unit makeup is going to do for 2026. And I'm kind of inclined to side with John here, and it is actually quite exciting to have this manual override mode, which is obviously that you can deploy the energy on the straights, and it sort of replaces DRS. So it's a sort of a push to pass system in a sense. Like IndyCar or Formula E could even have, I'm guessing. But yeah, the big worry is that people could run out of deployment on the straights, and that would be quite poor for the show. And my big worry is if there's an engine manufacturer that doesn't have that part of the power unit solved, the MG UK and the ERS deployment, they're going to be a massive backmarker next season.
Yeah, it's interesting, the whole question about the impact that the harvesting is going to have. We had Stefano Domenicali on the podcast recently who said he's not concerned because the idea about slowing on the straights or even downshifting on the straights is out of date. But at the same time, I spoke to a couple of drivers off record in the paddock in Hungary who said that, yeah, you are still doing that, and even on extreme deployment circuit, or rather extreme challenge circuits in terms of harvesting that energy you need, they are having to do it. But of course, equally, the current race drivers, they're not jumping in the sim every week to drive the 26 car, so they could be a little bit out of date with their expectations. So it's difficult, isn't it, John? Because we've heard a lot from a lot of drivers, and most of them have been gradations of negative, haven't they? You heard Lance Stroll talking about the fact there shouldn't be a science experiment, weird driving styles being talked about, etc. So it's clear that this change in power units having a profound impact, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the part of the problem is that, and this is something Nicholas Tombassis, the FIA single seater director, told me, is that if you put a racing driver into a car that has less grip and one that requires a bit more work on the straights, you won't find a single racing driver is happy with that. So I think you've got a scenario where if you put these drivers into 26 cars that had more grip and were easy to drive around corners and an absolute breeze on the straights and faster, then the automatic reaction is these are better. Ultimately, they're different. There's going to be a different challenge. And actually, you can argue that, there's less downforce in the corners, so it's going to be a bigger challenge for them. So corners like Cops now, for example, that are easy flat, it's going to be a lift. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to separate the good drivers from the less good drivers. So there are aspects. I think it's just going to take time to get used to it. But I think what's really, really important and what is going to define the success of these regulations is if they make sense to us as a spectacle. Because if we see drivers, you see Max Verstappen starts from pole position, is perfectly fine for 5 laps of the race, and then suddenly starts falling away on straights and finishes last every race, it's going to make no sense. If there's just random overtakings that happen just because one team's suddenly got a better battery use than another, even if their car's terrible, then that makes no sense. So it's going to need, the logic of the year is going to have to work a lot. And I think a lot will depend on the spectacle. And there's so much we still don't understand about how these things are going to play out, how they're going to harvest the energy in the corners. One T-Boss told me that, Baku, for example, is going to be crazy because very limited opportunity to recharge the battery. So the key to the lap time there basically will be how much you're on the throttle revving the engine out to its max in the city section, because that will then define how quick you're on the straights. So there's just so much that we don't know, that we can be worried about, that we think won't work. But I think until we actually see it in action, I think it's very hard for us to be definitive that this is a good step or this is a bad step.
One thing that I think is tangible at this stage is my biggest concern, Samarth, is that they've gone down this direction with the roughly 50-50 splits, and then they've had to bend over backwards with every other aspect of the regs to make it work, because they're going to be cars at 30% less downforce, something like 55% less drag, because they want the cars to be quick enough, have the lap time, so they're going to be very fast on the straights. And then we're going to get onto a little bit later the straight line mode and the cornering mode, etc. The tyres are a little bit narrower. They rather unfairly on Pirelli said, well, you're going to make the tyres a little bit narrower and they're going to have the same amount of grip, because they have to contribute to that drag reduction target as well. So that to me seems the tangible, in that has driven so much of the regulation on the chassis and related to the chassis side.
Seems in 2026 there's this move to reduce the amount of drag being produced by the car to make up for possible losses in power by the engine. And I think that's quite a scary ordeal for a lot of us, in a sense. It's quite a weird thing. They've caused a problem here, and they're trying to mitigate it with the straight line mode by reducing the amount of drag you have on straights. And that seems to be the problem here. It seems to be a kind of an odd solution to an odd problem, in a sense, that we didn't really know we needed in the first place. And this is why, if we go back to am I excited for next year's regs, this is one of the reasons I'm not. It just seems like we're kind of chasing little things here. Okay, can we reduce outwash, for example? Well, they've gone really heavy on that, but that might cause other problems. For this, can we increase the amount of the power unit that's producing electrical power? And they've caused another problem here. So now we're reducing drag to make up for that. So you've got the straight line mode, and I think, just to tack on to what John said earlier, does it increase the spectacle? Does it improve the spectacle to have a straight line mode? Does it make it any less complicated for people jumping in and watching in 2026? I don't think so. I think it's quite an interesting take from F1 to introduce something like that. It seems kind of a confusing and convoluted process, and I don't know why they've gone for it. I mean, I do. Again, they're making up for the possible losses of power. And, the top speed boost comes from manual override, not straight line mode, which is another confusing thing. If you looked at the regulations, you'd think straight line mode is actually the replacement for DRS, not manual override. But it just seems to be a very confusing set of regulations in that sense. I do hope it improves the spectacle and we don't see lots of kind of convoluted overtakes, but I'm not convinced right now as to whether that's going to improve the show.
Well, the interesting question will be what the performance profile will be like of the power units, because you could, in a more extreme case, have a scenario where a car's really quick in qualifying and they're very keen to make sure that the spectacle of qualifying is still there, but not so quick in the race, or it could work better at different tracks. So I guess, John, this is the big question, isn't it? We could see it creating lots of interesting swings in performance and variables and swings in performance, particularly if you can do them, say, between qualifying and a race and across race distances, etc., is actually what creates good racing, because you have cars being quick at different points of the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something Stefano Domenicali spoke about when we talked to him at the Hungarian Grand Prix, that there could be positive surprises in this, that there may be performance swings that, if we could get a good narrative that one power unit is better in qualifying, another one's better in races, another one's better on low speed corners, and another one's better at high speed venues with longer straights. There could be fantastic fluctuations. I'm sure there's going to be fluctuations, and I'm sure there's going to be an early phase to the season where teams and manufacturers don't really understand where the key performances are. Some may be focusing in the right areas, some in the wrong areas. So I think what will happen is that after the first phase of the season, there's going to be a scramble because people will realise this is the best approach for energy management. This is the best aerodynamic approach we need to balance out straight line mode and corner mode. This is the best strategy for energy harvesting. This is the best strategy for energy deployment. So I think there's going to be a very rapid learning process that F1's going to go through. And if it works, and if there are small differences, then it could be fascinating if these things are swinging around and it's moving around. But I think it all does depend on the extremes. And it's absolutely critical. It makes sense. And that these things are explained not only to us, but to the fans, because I think everyone in F1 accepts that they did a pretty poor job in explaining the turbo hybrid regulations when they came in 2014. Didn't educate people very well, didn't shout about how great they were, didn't shout how powerful they were, just wanted to moan about them not being as noisy as V8s. So they kind of failed when those regulations came in. They can't fail this time because I think people would be ready to jump on and criticise these ones very, very quickly, especially with this kind of not threat in the background, but element in the background that everyone is looking towards a longer term future with V8s and fully sustainable fuels. So there is no second chance for these power units. If they fail very quickly, then all that's going to do is just push the momentum for V8s, and they'll come in much sooner than a lot of manufacturers would like.
And it's great that it does create a lot of opportunity for innovation, doesn't it? Because removing the MGUH, it means that you can't use the MGUH to eliminate the turbo lag in the same way that you could before, because although you can use the electrical energy to smooth out or to a degree any limitation in terms of the conventional engine, you're going to be deploying as much as you possibly can of the electrical power anyway. So you can't use the MGUH to get the turbo spinning in the same way that you can now. So that creates all sorts of interesting questions about the strategy in terms of how you get the most out of that. That's a performance differentiator there. And that's the interesting thing, isn't it, Samarth? It creates all these technical opportunities. What do you do with your braking approach, that kind of thing? Now you're doing so much of the harvesting. That can be used to do more of the braking, etc. That has knock-on effects in other areas of the car. So I think we can safely say there will be things going on in terms of the design of cars that we haven't necessarily thought of or won't have been thought of on the outside, because you get these very clever ideas when you throw hundreds of designers and engineers and very brilliant F1 minds at solving a problem.
Well, I think that's the most exciting thing about having a new rule set that comes in next year, right? You've got the best problem solvers and some of the best problem makers on the planet, and they're all scrambling now to think of the things that you may not have seen come up. I mean, just going back to 2022, it looks ridiculous now looking back, but the amount of problems porpoising caused, a problem that had reared its ugly head in the previous ground effect era caused in 2022, was astonishing. So it's going to be a sort of NASA style, let's create all the problems we can now using simulation tools. Let's create all the problems now so we kind of do the amount of damage control we can and hit the ground running in 2026. And even then, new ones will come up. I think one of the interesting ones is, we've talked about deployment, we've talked about loss of power on the straights, but one of the interesting ones is, can you use straight line mode perhaps to make it harder for a car to follow? Because you're directing air there through the bottom of the car, you're stopping it mushrooming towards the top of the engine cover. Can you use that to actually make it harder to follow? So you can almost, to quote the F1 movie, make a car for combat, right? These are little things that you can do in 2026, little problems. This is what I do love about a new regulation set. These are the exciting things. And I think there's going to be stuff we just haven't thought of yet. But come, Bahrain and the first three races, we're going to realize that, something's definitely up here. Teams are hitting a problem. And they didn't even predict that coming in. Now, there is a little bit more track testing before the next season, which should help. But it's just not going to be enough to iron out every crease before the start of next season.
And of course, that first test in Barcelona is going to be done completely behind closed doors. No media there. There won't be any TV coverage, etc. So very much keeping it low key. And John, talking about some of the potential development avenues, you had a chat with Brembo at Hungary in terms of some of the braking ideas, and there's indications that there's some very different solutions and approaches being taken with, for example, the brakes, which obviously are pretty important for Formula One cars, but you've got this increased braking effect from the harvesting being so much more power hungry, shall we say.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting chat. It's one of Bridgestone's kind of senior customer engineers, and they work with, well, Brembo work with all the grid, but they provide various different elements to various teams. So all teams take their calipers. Some teams take their pads and discs and other elements, but they've got a broad knowledge of what's coming. And there are two interesting aspects to it. First of all is that the kind of the allowance of brakes next season is you can run bigger pads, bigger discs, bigger brakes, so for greater stopping power. So the regulations have opened that up. But actually, no team wants to go down that route because there's extra weight. So they're trying to find this compromise between what weight they don't want to have, because car weight is going to be an absolute critical factor next season. And it's not impossible. We have a 26 championship after all the talk we have about power units and Straightline mode and manual override and energy recovery and sustainable fuel, that the championship is won by the team that produces the lightest car, because everyone's struggling to hit the weight limit. If someone's found a way to do it and can get a car that's 20 kilos less than somebody else, then that's in effect 0.6 of a second per lap. That's a massive difference. So, don't rule that scenario out just yet. And I'm sure weight will be a critical factor. So that's the first element of the brakes, is that teams are mindful of weight on them. But the second one, which is more interesting, was he was talking about the designs at the rear of the car, which is where the energy is harvested through the system at the back. And he says that he's already seen two completely divergent approaches, basically. Some teams have been quite conservative in terms of how much the size of the discs they want at the back, the size of the stopping power from the discs themselves. But he says some teams have taken it to the absolute bare minimum. There's a clause in the regulation that kind of stipulates the kind of minimum stopping power that a car must have. And he says teams have taken it to the limit because it's clearly they're relying on, not on the brakes, physical brakes to slow the car, but they're relying on energy harvesting to slow the car. So there'll be some corners that nowadays, drivers are full on the brakes or dabbing the brakes into. They won't touch the brakes now. It'll all be done on energy harvesting. But what's interesting is probably one of these two solutions is wrong. So either the teams that have got the heavier brakes, the bigger brakes, have been too conservative. It's not the route to go. They're carrying excess weight they don't need. Or the teams that haven't got enough brakes and are relying on energy harvesting, actually, that's not the quickest way or best way to do it. It doesn't work. And then they've got to do a revamp. So I think this story of the brakes is going to be very true of a lot of aspects of these 26 cars. Is we're going to see a ton of solutions, maybe 30, 40 very different concepts across the grid. And very, very quickly, teams are going to narrow them down to the best, say, 30 solutions. And the first championships will be down to which team has got the best of all these different solutions in place. Because no one will have nailed everything, but it's who's nailed the most of them, I think, will be critical for next season.
Yeah, and even in areas you might not think are relevant, there could be a little bit of scope for change and battles. For example, it's still 8-speed gearboxes. You have to decide your 8 forward gear ratios at the start of the season. There is a joker now that you can, in 26 and 26 only, you can have a change of the ratios once. But that's significant because your gear shift strategy is also contributing to the energy harvesting. You might want to go a little bit more aggressive to maximise what you're harvesting in terms of how you do the downshifts and where you put the ratios and everything. So every aspect of the car almost mechanically is influenced by this, which is what makes it such a fascinating challenge. Right, Samarth, let's come back to the straight line mode and the cornering mode you talked about. People may have heard of that being talked about as X mode and Z mode, but that particular nomenclature has been ditched handily. It's fairly simple what straight line mode and cornering mode means, but can you just explain a little bit more about how that's working?
Yep, totally. And we already have DRS, right? So you've already seen 50% of what straight line mode is. But straight line mode in 2026 will include movable front and rear wings. And it's quite interesting why it's happening. It's to kind of reduce the amount of drag on the cars so that you're not penalized by top speed as much on the straights. And in some ways, it kind of mitigates the effect of how powerful manual override mode could be on the straights, the kind of push to pass mode that F1's going to implement next season. So it will by default, you'll be in cornering mode. And then when you hit a straight, you'll be on straight line mode where the front and rear wings open. It gives you, a bit of a top speed boost by reducing drag in a straight line, kind of like how DRS works now. So it's not totally different. And I kind of hope, oh boy, I've just realized in 2026, we're going to have so many explainers of this on commentary. Every time it's deployed on a car, someone's going to have to contractually say, and now straight line mode's been deployed. Anyway, so this is the first you're hearing about it now, and I hope you don't get too tired of it soon. So it's an extreme low drag setting. It's quite interesting. I'm going to plug Racetech again, RAST, RaceTEQ, racetech.com. But we're doing some CFD analysis of straight line mode. And it actually shows that while you're decreasing load on the front wing by opening it up, you might actually be increasing the amount of load on the floor, which is because it's channeling air inwards, and it could actually make the floor kind of more powerful. But you're never going to notice it because you're not really going to use it on corners. However, as I touched on before, what it might do is that airflow, it will create more turbulent airflow towards the rear of the cars. So as I said, teams might actually find it not as easy to follow in some straights. And I guess it depends what we define as a straight as well. I mean, I don't know. There's a bit of uncertainty about where it's going to be used. But if it's a straight with a kink in it, for example, you might find that some teams find worse balance going into that while they're in straight line mode, considerably so that it disrupts balance, for example. To have movable airflow on the front and rear of the car also brings up some serious dilemmas for teams as to how much load they kind of put on the front and rear in the first place, because it will change balance massively again. So it's going to be a bit of a trade-off, and it's going to be interesting to see how teams wrestle with having to use it for the first time in a race situation. You're not going to have much testing, following another car, seeing how it works. So yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. My worry with it is that it might seem a bit too convoluted for the average F1 fan coming into 2026. Now you've got manual override mode and straight line mode. So it just has to be well explained, I think. And it has to be seen as improving the spectacle.
I thought that the straight line mode and the cornering mode almost become invisible for the most part, except in scenarios like you talk about where maybe there's a kink, because the intention is to have straight line mode deployable anytime you're not traction limited, i.e. when you can be at 100% throttle, so you're effectively not in any way cornering, and that will include some kinks and that kind of thing. So that element might become quite invisible, but it's it's difficult to know completely, because we are still waiting, aren't we, John, for them to finalise all the details in terms of exactly how it'll all be used, and there's still a lot of fine tuning going on with these regs even as we speak now, isn't there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainties, and a lot of these things don't actually crop up until teams explore them or explore certain circumstances in the wind tunnel. There was one topic that came up recently, relates to straight line mode in wet weather races, because obviously it's going to be disabled in poor conditions, which sounds quite a straightforward thing that happens, because DRS these days is disabled when it's wet. It's logical straight line mode would be disabled when it's wet. Except the problem is that teams will be wanting to base their ride height on a car that has straight line mode activated on straights. So it's less downforce on the car, not enough downforce is pushing it down onto the ground. So when straight line mode is activated, it means you can run your car much closer to the ground, because it's not a problem. But if it's deactivated in wet races and then isn't reactivated, then that means there'll be more downforce on the straights, more forces pushing the car down, the plank's going to wear away, and that could prompt some disqualification. So what happens in these situation scenarios? And I think this is just the start of what's going to be very, very lengthy conversations, and probably lots of details and clarifications and TDs as we get closer to 26, because there are going to be scenarios that nobody's thought about at the moment that's going to crop up. I'm sure there's going to be loopholes that people have found. There's going to be elements that some team will think they've got the eureka element and they'll be keeping quiet about it, and it will be unleashed in testing or at the first races, or there'll be some deployment tricks or something. I think it's going to be very intriguing start to the year as teams not only try to guess what the others are doing, but try to keep secret areas that they think is making a big difference.
It's always interesting to keep an eye on every time they reissue the regs, because you get the changes highlighted. And I was going through the regs recently. There's just an interesting little line that says no rear suspension member may be attached to the power unit. That's been added in the latest one, and it just made me wonder, well, has someone talked about trying to do that, or is someone worried someone might do that? But it just tells you how much they're rethinking some of these the orthodoxies of car design. So that's been outlawed. That won't happen. But you're seeing lots of these little things thrown in. But it's also interesting, Samarth, isn't it, in terms of the overall aero challenge of the car, because there's less dependence on underfloor aero. That they still are going to work in ground effect, but not in quite the same way. There's a bit more emphasis on top body. The cars are not going to run as low as they do currently. They're probably going to end up running about halfway between where they are now and where they were in 2021, the last year of the old regs, in terms of the static ride height anyway. But what have you learned about the kind of aerodynamic challenges of these cars?
Well, a lot of it is that the FIA has introduced a new set of regulations that decrease the amount of outwash to make it easier to follow the car in front. What that seems to be doing is pushing the air inwards. So you're getting quite a lot of front wheel tyre squirt, but it actually translates into an even worse rear wheel tyre squirt. And I think this is going to be a big area when we look into the paddock on the first weekend of next season, or even testing. It's going to be a big area that we look at, the diffuser, because when you have that much tyre squirt coming off the rear wheels, it can destabilize the diffuser quite easily. And I think it's going to be a big problem for teams to keep that area of the car quite powerful and interacting the way it should be, because you won't have stuff like porpoising, but you can have sudden drops of downforce created by the diffuser. Big areas of the car not behaving as you want it to. It could be a real problem for teams there, and I'm really interested to see what they do in that area, what they do around the rear wing to mitigate that kind of factor of squirt coming into the car towards the rear. Definitely as a big problem downstream. The other interesting thing we've noticed about the 2026 F1 cars, I don't know if we've touched on this already, is the return of those kind of barge boardy bits at the front of the floor. And design wise, that's going to throw right back to pre-2022 F1 cars. But there's going to be a lot of activity there in making sure airflow gets channeled to the right areas, under the side pods and over the side pods as well, and you kind of have clean flow towards the back. It's going to be really interesting to see. And I think one of the most exciting things about the new regulations, and it's something that's quite a bit of a shame now when you get into the late stage of old regulations, as we can call them now, is that the cars just converge on similar designs. But next season, I'm expecting we should see some very wildly different ones at the start. And then they will inevitably converge on the one that works.
Yeah, that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? But it's interesting to note the various challenges they've got, because there's a challenge with the front wheel wake in terms of how that interacts with the front of the floor and I think the foot plate, they call it, at the front of it. That's quite a challenge because of the reduction of inwash. And one thing we do know, although there's been this attempt to reduce the outwash in order to make following possible, teams will find ways to recreate it, just as they found with this rule set. So that's an interesting question, isn't it, John? A lot of effort's gone on into the raceability of these cars, but it's just the natural order of things, isn't it? There's a push and pull. The governing body comes up with regs that their studies suggest will reduce the use of the outwash and therefore mitigate the turbulence. And then, of course, you'll get 10 F1 teams with a combined total of thousands of people trying to undo all that good work and create the outwash that they want again, because it's good for the performance of the car.
This is the fundamental conflict that's been at the heart of Formula One forever, that the FIA and FOM want to create great racing for entertainment because it's important for the show and for keeping fans interested. But the teams don't care about, ultimately, the quality of the show. It's their interests to create they're in their ideal world, each of them is to create the most boring race possible, where their drivers finish 1-2 with zero effort, and they rock up every weekend, and that's it. And that's, to them, that's the best scenario. That's not the best scenario for FI and F1. So you've constantly this kind of toing and throwing between these competing elements, and it'll be the same thing in 26. That for all the efforts of the FIA to get the kind of the wake better, to allow cars to follow each other closer, to not have turbulent air, to improve the racing, teams don't care. If avenues open up, like they did with these regulations, there were some areas that the FI didn't close off on this regulation, especially around the front wing end plate, kind of where the wake was being pushed off and with outwash that was exploited, and that basically derailed most of the efforts that were put in for the start of 22, which is why things have got steadily worse. And also, as the downforce increases, it gets harder and harder for cars to follow because they're losing a greater percentage relative of their peak potential around corners. So, as we head towards cars with much less downforce, which theoretically can follow closer, and with straight line mode and this manual override mode that in theory should allow overtaking to be easier because it's not aerodynamically related, it's power related, then the ingredients are there for it to be good racing. But it's a very fine balance, as we found DRS over time, that DRS can be a great overtaking tool. It was never intended to make overtaking guaranteed. It was supposed to make it possible. But, we've always fallen between these worlds where DRS is either too hard to overtake, not effective enough, like at Spa this year, where it probably is, the zones have become too short now for modern cars. Or I recall, Turkey when it was around, that it just became ridiculously how easy it was. And then it kind of devalues overtaking. So these are all elements that have to be juggled quite a lot by the FI and FOM to go back to the story that fans and everyone have to understand the narrative of the season, and success has to make sense, and success has to become as a result of a meritocracy, not complete fluke down to some random factor that nobody can explain and no one understands.
Well, that's the hope, isn't it? That it will create interesting storylines, but not through randomness or things going catastrophically wrong, etc. And it is going to be really interesting when the cars are launched to see the different solutions. And one trend we may see over time is there is on paper a benefit from running these cars high rake potentially, as we saw towards the end of 21. But the big problem you've got now is you don't have as many tools as you had back then to seal the underfloor, particularly around the rear of the car. But you may see gradually that rake creeping up as these cars evolve, and you may see some marked differences between cars when they first start running next year. So lots of interesting aero challenges there. Should we come back, John, to the driving styles now? Because most drivers have had a go in the simulator at the 2026 car. They've been talking about it. What's their feedback been like? Because there's been some pretty negative stuff, it's fair to say, isn't there?
Yeah, I think there's two schools of thought here. There's the school of thought that kind of Lance Stroll has put forward and Charles Leclerc didn't like, that they're not very nice to drive around the corners, and the energy harvesting and deployment tactics aren't much fun because drivers are going to be having to manage how much energy they can use, then manage this because kind of some weirdness in the corners, either changing too far down the gearbox, high revs in slow corners, just to try to harvest as much energy. I think it's going to be a weird style of racing. And then there's a school of thought from Fernando Alonso that, it's wrong to make a definitive verdict on the 26 cars based only on the sim, that there's no end of times you try things in the simulator, you think it's good or it's rubbish, doesn't translate to real life. And ultimately, and I think he senses this, that these regulations provide opportunity for clever drivers. They provide opportunity to find the areas in the regulations where performance comes from. And as he pointed out, the driver that wins and the team that wins are going to think these 26 regs are amazing. The teams that are struggling at the back and can't get a grip of them are going to hate them. And we're going to be in this world. And I think Fernando made this reference to, if you put the entire grid of racing drivers, the entire F1 grid into higher cars with 12 horsepower or something, and gave them a race around a track, they would have a ton of fun, even if it's 988 horsepower less than a current Formula One car. And the person that wins would absolutely love it, and it would be the best feeling in the world. And I think this is where we'll probably end up in 26, that those that see the opportunity and see the benefit and get the most out of it are going to think these regulations are amazing. And there'll be people where it hasn't worked out, all the ambitions came in, will be complaining like mad that these regulations are terrible, we don't like the energy harvesting, we don't like the way we're swallowed up on straights, it's not a fun way to go racing. And they will be the ones calling for, let's get to V8s as quick as possible.
The interesting thing is there is, as you've alluded to, great potential for drivers to influence it. There's two elements. Obviously, you're trying to harvest 8.5 megajoules of energy a lap. So you need to drive in a way that maximises that, and that could be an area where we see differences. And because of the fact that there's the idea that the speed will drop off a bit towards the end of straights, you're almost getting this lift and coast effect into every corner. And then there's a desire to brake late and get the car dynamic, the car balance you want on turning. One thing some of the drivers have said is that actually the the general car balance is actually quite nice. It's quite it's not massively oversteery, understeery. You don't have this problem of the split in the speed range that we've got now, that you can have a car that's is understeery in the low speed and oversteery in the high speed, and it's really, really hard to get the balance through that. So they could be actually quite nice to drive from that regard. But this is interesting, isn't it, Samarth? Because you get to a point where technically drivers could, if they find a way, say in a race stint, to be able to drive very quickly, but also maximise the harvesting that they're doing. And some of that will lie in terms of the way the driver does things, in terms of the braking, the downshift, etc. Then you really could find yourself a tangible advantage.
Absolutely, Ed. I think that's one of the things that comes with a new set of regulations, and it might reward. I mean, people like Fernando Alonso, I think, are so good at kind of shaping their driving style to the new regulations. I think he's always been good at that. But I think moving away from the ground effect era might be really good for some. Just taking away that kind of peakiness of the cars, where you had kind of swings of oversteer and understeer throughout a lap, and you still have drivers complaining about it now. I mean, Lewis Hamilton seems to really, really hate this era of cars. It might benefit him in a massive way. I can't say more than that, because it really, really depends on how the car actually behaves at the end of the day. Not all of them are going to behave the same way. Every team is going to have different characteristics. Someone's going to nail it and someone's going to absolutely biff it at the start of the season, and that's just how it is, right? Maybe we'll get onto who will nail it later, but at this stage you can't say. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how drivers will have to work around the new technical challenges, the new regulations, for sure. Yeah,
it's going to be fascinating when we do get to testing, to be able to watch trackside and see what we can see and watch the onboards and that kind of thing. I think that'll be a fascinating challenge. I think the one thing we can be fairly confident of is, while some drivers have been exposed to particularly extreme ways of driving, pretty much universally, it starts off when there's a big change being a bigger shift, and then it gets a little bit more normal. And I suspect that by the time we get to next year, the driving will quite quickly seem normal. One thing that is interesting is a few people have said that you're going to see some tracks that are pretty much the same as now. Like if you go to a Hungaroring or somewhere like that, lots of opportunity to harvest, not really too much of a problem and a difference. But you go to low harvesting circuits, and that's where you're going to have a big problem, where you can't harvest as much as you need to deploy. And that's the key thing. That's the key thing with these, isn't it? There's a huge amount of electrical power, and you need to harvest that energy. So things will get more normal, but things may be more normal at some circuits compared to others, and that's another thing we should bear in mind next year when we're starting to understand and build a picture of the performance profiles. Right, Samarth, we're going to give you the big question now, the one that everybody listening wants to know. Who's going to do well under these new regulations? Is it going to be a repeat of the 2014 Mercedes supremacy? Can you foresee that happening? So just let us know who's going to win the first race of next year and who's going to be world champion. That's all we ask.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about this at the race towers the other day. And honestly, it is impossible to say before next season starts. So I'm going to preface my very cowardly answer by saying that. Secondly, there's one team that should do well next season. And I say it ought to do well, and that is Aston Martin. With everything it has invested in its factory, in having Honda come back to F1, in having, Alonso stay on, in having Aramco provide fuel, in literally picking up a dream team of technical personnel, I feel like there is very little excuse for that team not to be doing well and not contending at least for the Constructors' Championship in 2026 onwards. Is that the team I'd like to say I'm backing? No, because that would be too easy. It'd be too easy to say the team that has invested the most into everything and brought together the dream team will go and win. I feel like Mercedes nailed the last engine regulation, so it has a really good chance of doing so again here. But again, these are all too simplistic guesses for something that is just such an unknown coming into next year. But again, I would be surprised if those two teams do not hit the ground running in 2026 for sure.
And of course, you've got the question of if the Mercedes power unit is strong, then there is a Mercedes powered team that's doing a lot better than the works team at the moment in McLaren. So I think McLaren definitely can't be counted out as well when it comes to that. And this is the interesting thing, isn't it, John? There's so many factors, because it's not just the power unit development, the car development. There's the whole battle going on in terms of the fuels, because the fuels have to be now made up of 100% certified advanced sustainable components. So that's a big step, and there's been lots of talk about the expense of this fuel as well that all the fuel companies are creating. So there's a very complicated mix of factors that are going to define the competitiveness of all of these teams, and again could create different performance profiles qualifying against race. Performance in races at tracks that have a very good balance in terms of the energy harvesting against those that are a bit more stressful, and that's why it makes it really, really hard to guess, because nobody really knows, do they?
Yeah, I think it's a complete guess to try to work out who is quickest, and it could be that there are 10 factors you need in place to be successful next year, because it's not just going to be about aero or your tyre management or your brake cooling or your energy harvesting or your energy recovery or your straight line mode aero balance or your cornering mode aero balance. You could get 9 of these things spot on and you miss one, and that derails your entire championship and stops you winning a race. And I think this is what's really intriguing, because there's arguments you can have with virtually anybody to be there. You could have a team, a customer team like Alpine, for example, that's not doing well at the moment, but it gets its hand on a decent engine. It builds a car that's 20 kilos lighter than anybody else, and it's away and it's winning races. I think the possibility is there. The head says that you would expect Mercedes to be there because it succeeded these regulations. It spent time on it. The kind of vibe and feedback you get from it is of not the alarm bells ringing that we hear from Ferrari and Red Bull and Audi. But they could get one of these 10 factors wrong. They could get 2 or 3 wrong. Someone else can do something better. So I think it's completely open, and I think it's a kind of fool's errand to try to think that it's definitely going to be this team and they've got the advantage, because you could pretty much argue for 7 or 8 teams to be winning races next year, I would have thought. And in extreme scenarios, even some of the customer teams that appear to be a bit behind could even be up there.
And of course, reliability will be a factor as well. I always remember when the 2014 rule change happened and the new power units, teams could barely get any laps under their belt at the start of testing. It seemed inconceivable they'd be able to get to the finish of the Australian Grand Prix when you watch testing. So that's another question as well. Are we going to have it's going to be behind closed doors, so we won't do it. But I always remember watching at Jerez with Gary Anderson. We were just hanging around in the open pit lane, just chatting with people, because nobody went out in the first 40, 50 odd minutes. And then when the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton finally went out, that was after some time, and it was very, very few and far between the actual laps completed on that first day. So there's so much potential for these storylines, and that's what's so exciting, because we don't know what way it's going to go. And I guess, Samarth, that's the beauty of the rule changes, isn't it? Because it creates so much uncertainty, and it's easy at this stage to be negative about it. But surely the fact there's uncertainty and there's change means, you know what, this is pretty exciting, because we can do 6 months of speculating as to what may happen and making arguments for who may be good, what drivers may adapt well. And you can found some of that in rational argument, but everything is on the table still.
Absolutely, Ed. I mean, the great thing about new regulations is that we enter a period of unknown. And you've got the best engineers, as I said, the best problem solvers, but also the best problem makers. And they're going to do their best to hit the ground running next season. But, I mean, it's impossible to predict what will happen in a sense. There's just so many variables. And I'm really excited to see, what next year brings. But I have to say, it is a bit of a shame to kind of throw away this regulation now for next year, when all the teams were converging and we have possibly what is the closest midfield I've seen in ages. If we see such a massive gap next year, it just won't be as exciting.
It's not close at the front, though. McLaren are going to win virtually everything. So you can argue that maybe it's time for change.
But then you could also argue that one team will come steamroller next year, and then you'll have another team at the front, and then you'll have an incredibly close midfield this year, and you won't have that next year. You'll have a massively punched out field. And is that as exciting? I don't know. Was 2014 more exciting than the previous years?
Yeah, I think it was. But I think I think the important thing is that with Formula One, there's always been change, hasn't there? And for a long time, for decades in Grand Prix racing, it was the technological evolution that drove everything. And as time's gone on, increasingly regulations have got more restricted. It's had to have been more by design. And we now have these regular rule changes. And yeah, change is normal, isn't it? So I think in that regard, it's hard not to be excited by the possibilities, even if the reality might not deliver on those. But it also, the reality might not deliver on the most negative expectations. That's the exciting thing. But one thing's for sure, this is going to be a huge talking point in the coming months. And that's why we wanted to kind of have this foundational chat about some of the expectations for what we're going to see next year. There's loads more detail we can go into and will be getting into over the coming months. And we hope you've enjoyed this insight. So thanks very much to Samarth. Thanks to John as well. We're keeping on podcasting throughout the August break. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.